perspective, going back basically over a 70-year period, every spatial concentration of people of color has been dispersed. 70 years ago, it was redlining, disinvestment by race.
Louder, please. Louder.
70 years ago, it was done by investment redlining by the government. They draw a red line around a zip code that had black people in it, and there'd be no mortgages. After World War II, you had urban renewal, as Deborah described. In the 1970s, in this city, you had planned shrinkage. More recently, we've had a renewal of planned shrinkage called Hope 6. That's where you see public housing being dynamited. That's the new urban renewal. We now have Hope 6 in New York. As Malcolm X used to say, the names have changed, but the game's the same. Now, we've gone to the next stage that has a new name. It's called gentrification. Disperse communities of color, resegregate them because this is an apartheid state. The United States is an apartheid state. Resegregate communities of color after dispersing their accumulations of social, economic, and political capital. Target them again using a new policy with a new name. Redlining, urban renewal, planned shrinkage, Hope 6. Now, we tend to play it as it lays. We play the game. We play the American game. Many of us are apartheid fundamentalists in the United States. We may believe in evolution, but we believe in apartheid. We believe that American apartheid works on its own terms, that people who are segregated are separate from the rest of us, one way or another. What happens in the white communities is separate from Harlem. What happens in Harlem is separate from the white communities. The real world, since the invention of the railroad, is much more interconnected. And this separateness is in many respects an illusion. It is a spatial separateness. But in terms of patterns of public health and public order, the paradox of American apartheid is the more you segregate, the more you become linked. I'll get into that. But outside of the American game and American style, the American style racial Taliban that believes in apartheid, we have another game. Within the United Nations, there is a growing body of international law on population displacement. And if you go to the UN Human Rights Commission website, just do a search on the term development displacement. Stuff comes up from 10 years ago, 15 years ago. I'm going to quote from a UNHCR document, 1993. The practice of forced displacement involves the involuntary removal of persons from their homes or land, directly or indirectly attributable to the state. The causes of forced evictions are very diverse. The practice can be carried out in connection with development and infrastructure projects, housing or land reclamation measures, prestigious international events, unrestrained land or housing speculation, housing renovation, urban redevelopment or city beautification initiatives and mass relocation or resettlement programs. The practice of forced eviction shares many characteristics with related phenomena such as population transfer, internal displacement of persons, forced removals during or as a result or object of armed conflict, ethnic cleansing, mass exodus, refugee movements. Development displacement, according to a growing body of international law, is viewed as simply another form of ethnic cleansing. Harlem is being, and other communities of color in the United States, we're going from Hope 6 to gentrification. Another form of ethnic cleansing. If you take an international perspective, there is a vast body of research on the effects of ethnic cleansing, the effects of turning communities into refugee populations, the effects of turning communities into de facto refugee camps. The American system of apartheid over the last 70 years, from redlining, to urban renewal, planned shrinkage, to Hope 6, and now to gentrification, involves forced displacement of communities of color, their resegregation after the loss of economic, political, and social capital. Communities of color in the United States have been relegated to permanent refugee status as a matter of continuing public policy. This violates fundamental tenets of international law and human rights. What happens in refugee camps? There's a large literature on public health and public order in refugee camps. And you would recognize it. High rates of tuberculosis, high rates of sexually transmitted diseases, high rates of substance abuse, high rates of interpersonal and intergang violence. Does this sound familiar? I live on 123rd Street and Broadway on the 16th floor in one of those developments that was done by Columbia and, to isolate itself from Harlem. And I hear the gunfire. People here live and heard that gunfire. If you look at the pattern of public health and public order in the United States, particularly in New York, in the New York metro region. Now remember, New York is Rome. This is the center of the new Roman Empire. This is the capital of the American Empire. It is linked to the rest of the empire closely by travel patterns, by what we call the probability of contact matrix. As go Harlem and the South Bronx, as go Los Angeles South Central. In many respects, so goes the nation because of that close linkage. One of the great aftermaths of war is tuberculosis. Traditionally, at the end of every war, there's been a tuberculosis epidemic. At the end of the urban burnout of the 1970s, beginning early in 1980 and through 1993, New York City had a mysterious tuberculosis outbreak. Consequence of turning large areas of the city into de facto refugee camps by public policy, these policies of ethnic cleansing. Sexually transmitted diseases. In the words of one public official who worked in the Bronx, quote, planned shrinkage shotgunned AIDS all over the Bronx, unquote. Originally in the Bronx, AIDS was confined mostly to densely packed social networks of intravenous drug abusers. Come planned shrinkage, those networks were dispersed all over the borough. The sexual partners of those infected people were the sexual partners of other people over a larger geographic area. Planned shrinkage shotgunned AIDS over the Bronx. When you do analysis of cities that devastated their ghettos, it's not just New York. New York, if you go across the country, Washington, D.C., Chicago, L.A., there is not one intact black urban neighborhood. We did a study around the cities where this process was carried out. AIDS became regionalized in the sense that it got into the daily journey, the commuting field defined by the daily journey to work, so that outlying areas became linked with the internal city's AIDS epidemic. And that only occurred around cities like New York that had engaged in planned shrinkage. Also in those cities, it has become difficult because of the shredding of social networks. This doesn't just go away. Once you do this, you create a refugee camp. It stays a refugee camp for 40 or 50 years. The response to AIDS has been a drug industry response. Treat infected individuals, don't change the social conditions. It's well known all over the world that AIDS goes through the flaws in a country's society like water through cracks in ice. People in devastated ghetto areas don't have ready access to antiretrovirals, the drugs that control HIV. As a consequence, those neighborhoods are now becoming hotbeds of multiple drug-resistant HIV. The gentrification
to 54, which was then what was it called? 54th Street, which was anyway. I don't remember now. I'm so tired. Well, it was 50, but it was called something else at that time. San Juan Hill, exactly. San Juan Hill, exactly. And then finally, the arrival in Harlem, and what James Wilson Johnson said is he posed the question: if blacks are not able to hold on to Harlem, then what will be their fate? And that is the conclusion that has been reached here, because if you're not able to stay in Harlem, being pushed to the outer boroughs is not enough, because capital is insatiable and it is always feeding itself. So then the outer boroughs is to a next place and to a next, because we're really talking in part about something that Sam Anderson and others talked, and Bill Sales talked about last night. Is not only apartheid, but we're really talking about almost the elimination of people. And I don't think that's dramatic, because we all witnessed Katrina, because we were left to die. So we don't have to see this as some kind of elaborate conspiracy theory, when in fact we saw the evidence of that, modern day evidence of this wholesale genocide against people. That's what we saw. And then, of course, the Wallaces talked about the Native American. Native Americans as being the first victim. It wasn't just forced into reservation. What we're really talking about is the genocide of a people. So we've had, that was food for thought. You agree? Yes. Okay, so we laid it out there. So we're going to have some little question and answer, no long speeches. That's my job, not yours, because I'm sure a lot of people are going to want to say something. So let's have some Q&A here. Anybody want to start the ball rolling? Cleo.
Thank you very much for that information. questions about the historical development that the young lady raised and the fires. During the 60s, I came to New York in 1966 as a VISTA volunteer, and my assignment was the South Bronx. I was involved in housing organizing in the South Bronx at that time, and one of the interesting things about that period was the impact of the housing takeovers, where people in the buildings actually began to take over those buildings, and also then the impact of the Young Lords of the Black Panther Party coming in and doing that organizing rent strikes, and that continued. So one of the interesting things that you raised about the fires was that, you know, this was something that having to do with the Rand Corporation and all that. Our view of it at that point was that they wanted to wipe out the memory of all of these hundreds of buildings that had been taken over by people in the community, and that they had taken those buildings over, had built escrow accounts, and began to renovate those buildings and all that. That's the first question. Number two, the question of the 80s and what happened here and the impact of the importation of crack cocaine into our community and how that was also part of that process that you were talking about, sir.
Well, certainly one of the principal objectives of the planned shrinkage program was a dispersal of concentrations of political, economic, and social capital, dispersal of a voting bloc. Actually, we took all of this to the U.S. Attorney of the Southern District towards the end of the Carter administration, and we had a meeting downtown in that fortress. We met with the U.S. Attorney, the Assistant U.S. Attorney, and an FBI man from the Civil Rights Division. That was under Carter. That wasn't, you know. And the FBI man said flat out that it looked to him like the city was trying to break up voting blocks using fire service cuts. So they'll break up the voting blocks, they'll break up the Young Lords, they'll break up whatever infrastructure exists in these communities. All right, second, crack cocaine. I mean, once the social networks go due to forced displacement, something's going to come in. Some drug. I mean, it'll be a recurrence of the heroin epidemics. It'll be something is going to come into that vacuum. And it turned out to be crack cocaine. It was made much worse by the social conditions resulting from the displacement. It would have come in, but it wouldn't have been as bad.
Anyone else? Over here. Maybe you want to stand? Yes, ma'am. Oh, will you stand?
Thank you. Bed-Stuy was one of the neighborhoods that you talked about that had fire companies removed before. It had a fire company removed by Bloomberg, and it has a very high rate of fires now. This past week, as all of you know, there was a very historic vote at City Hall where the City Council refused to even name a street in Bed-Stuy for Sonny Carson, which the neighborhood had wanted. The reason I say historic was because it was a strict European, non-European breakdown on the vote. Not only one person from the Black, Puerto Rican, Asian caucus voted against the amendment that would have put Sonny Carson's name on, and that was Sarah Gonzalez. And one person from the European community, Bella from Queens, voted with the caucuses to name it. A number of people abstained, and a number of people were absented themselves. It was a very, very close vote, but what it demonstrated was a clear breakdown in the city, just complete breakdown between the old European communities and the communities of color. What do you see coming out of this? You brought the United Nations into it. And I see this as like a lower level of that. I mean, what do you see, though? How do you see the importance of this street naming thing?
All right. This is the home city of the United Nations. Are they going to ignore de facto ethnic cleansing on their doorstep by the host nation, which acts as if international law doesn't apply to it? Would this not be an embarrassment to the United Nations if brought before them that they're ignoring ethnic cleansing on their own doorsteps? It's not just local, it's the home of the UN. They owe.
You know, and I hope Joe raised his hand. Remember when Malcolm talked about before this assassination to take the case of genocide, basically, of black people to the United Nations? So it's not new, and I'd just like to add, in terms of the change in political dynamics in the world, even with the American administration in control of the United Nations, my only difference is whether it's Republican or Democrat, their role is to protect that of capital and the advancement and growth of capital in this country. But that's not the point. The point is whether or not the UN can become an international forum for the rest of the world in terms of U.S. contradictions. And we can see that the quote, developing world or the South is not the same as it was 10 years ago, because just look at Latin America. And they threaten Chavez all the time, but they can't turn it around. They have a policy of economic integration and people integration, which leads to political integration in Latin America on a scale that is unparalleled to the history of development in Latin America. And the U.S. thought that it had the green light with the collapse of the Soviet Union and the collapse of the Eastern Bloc. But it has just generated more and more contradictions for them, which is what this last panel is going to talk about with Kamosi Woodard and Brian Jones and Lynn Stewart if she's here. But it is just to give some context to what has been proposed here, that the United Nations isn't a panacea in and of itself, but it can be an important forum in terms of the issue of forced displacement and genocide against the people. And it's whether or not we have the will to do it. But I saw a hand over here, Joe.
I just have a very short comment to make, too. You triggered something about genocide and Katrina. I was in Rwanda when Katrina hit, and I was watching. They knew genocide. These were survivors of genocide, and they were utterly and completely shocked. I'm talking about people that saw 1 million people killed, and when they were watching CNN and the regular news reports on the TVs, they were like, "This is America? You're kidding me!" I mean, they were like utterly, they were completely taken aback, and really a lot of them had sort of a moment in terms of their view of the United States. Because prior to that time, I spoke of racism and ongoing racism and apartheid, and a lot of them came to me and said, I saw the situation of Katrina in New Orleans yesterday. You were right, Joseph. You were 100% right. I didn't realize that. So that whole thing of genocide is how to see people that have experienced genocide and how they react to Katrina was very, very enlightening for me, and shows what the reality was. And the other question was, the other thing was sort of that's the symbolic thing about Sonny Carson. I mean, you have a city full of names of racists, and from Vanderbilt, Robert Barons, and Washington, slave master, and Jefferson wrote, that black people smell because of the functioning of our inadequate functioning of our kidneys, and even Gates Avenue. I believe that was a founding father. Probably was a slave man. He signed the Declaration of Independence. Also my experience, maybe we should have a total purge of the names of New York City, or revision. I was in Sims. Oh, well, he doesn't have a street name yet.
He has a statue.
Yeah, well, you have a statue right down here on Central Park West of Theodore Roosevelt with a black man and a Native American enthralled by the white conqueror. And nobody ever told people don't. Well, I don't want to take away. I'll finish up. But I remember the first 30 years ago, when brothers from the AIM threw a bucket of red paint on that statue. Remember that? Old folks remember that, right? And I thought they were going to tear that down, but don't start me. Somebody should tear that down. I'm not advocating it, but it won't be a bad thing because I don't know who's going to report me. I'm not advocating something that should be done, get done, but hope it gets done. It comes with sense too. But the thing I was just going to finish on was I was in Maputo, in Mozambique. I don't know if anybody's been there, but that's the other extreme. Almost every street in that city is named after a revolutionary leader. Julius Nyerere Avenue, Amilcar Cabral, Fidel Castro, Nelson Mandela, all of the major leaders, Mundelein Avenue. In fact, when I got there, there was a cab driver, and Samoa Machel, and I said, oh yeah, I'm going to, where's Mao Zedong Boulevard? Oh, that's over there. Oh, where's Julius Nyerere? Oh, where's Lumumba Avenue? Oh, you've been here before. You lived here a long time. I said, Kim Il-sung Avenue. So if you really want to, talk about the hypocrisy of this thing with Sonny Carson, was just another insult to the black community, black and Latin community in New York, why don't you start renaming all of these things? In medicine, I'll just say one last thing. In medicine, there's a disease called Reiter's syndrome. It's a sexually transmitted disease. And there was movement in the medical community to change the name because Reiter was a Nazi. Reiter said this sexually transmitted was a manifestation of sexual transmission of gonorrhea. It's called Reiter's disease. And there was a movement in the community to rename things because he was a Nazi and you write here his writings. This is a manifestation of Jewish and Untermensch degeneration and blah, 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 blah. So renaming things, you should, not just naming things positively, but renaming things to take away these negative names, that we don't have to walk down streets and be insulted. We're insulted. I live on Washington Avenue. I live on Jefferson Avenue. I live on an avenue where a man said that I stink because my kidneys don't work right. But see, that doesn't kick into the city council, and because of all the manifestations, everything that was just presented here, our lack of political power, social power, economic power that exists in America today, and hopefully this is the process of reversing it.
Joe was a doctor in Rwanda and was there for 2 years? And was there for 2 years. The brother has an amazing array of stories, experiences, and analysis, politically and otherwise. So if you want to say something, let's just get up and sort of say it so that we can have kind of a dialogue and interactive with this. The thing about crystal meth, it really is amazing because they've had specials on TV. It is a drug that is devastating small town, middle white America and working class America. It is devastating those communities. And there are reports the increase in the number of hospital visits. The hospitals are being so overburdened. They don't have the money to take care of it because you can't contain the scourge of drugs. Remember when they flooded our communities with it and the guy of the reporter from the San Jose Mercury, who was mysterious, not to get into but he was mysteriously found dead. And he wrote about this. Remember, he wrote about this. He was eventually fired, and he was just hounded and whatever, because it's not Robert Fisk. I don't know why my brains are not working today. He's on BAI, and they talk about the U.S. drug cartel through the U.S. Army that brings drugs into the country. Ralph Shulman is one of them, and there is someone else, a former CIA agent, who also talks about it as well. All right. So, are there any other questions or comments?
Well, I would just mention that at Crystal Court at City Council, when it came up during the budget hearings, the council people who were listening to the budget said, "Oh, Crystal Meth is almost gone."
Yeah, right. Well, okay. This gentleman in the back? Yes.
Yeah, I'd just like to say the best antidote for asthmatic, China, all of them, is a glass of water. Make sure that anybody who suffers from asthma drink a glass of water before they go to bed. And that will be done. Or if they have an attack, give them a glass of water.
Okay. Now, let me just say, any other questions? Because generally, when you have a conference, people talk, but what we are talking about is also solutions. The idea of taking this, because when you present ideas, then you have to talk about how do you, in fact, implement the idea? How do you organize around the idea? I meant to say or propose, let's take this to the UN, to the United Nations. Well, easier said than done. What is the game plan for the execution of the idea? So let's see if we could have, if there is any discussion about that. Because remember, it's not new. Malcolm talked about it. D12 is always in the UN, and they're taking the issues of reparations to the United Nations. But let's talk about this idea of this genocide through forced evacuation of people, and how is it to be executed? Can you share your thoughts about that?
Well, we are technical experts. We are expert witnesses,
Not organizers.
not organizers. We can make the case. I mean, Deborah's worked with lawyers, and actually in most of the large toxic fires of the 1970s and 80s. I mean, we can put together, in concert with a skilled human rights lawyer, we could put together the case. But somebody, you have to have a client. Expert witnesses are not clients. You have to have somebody who's going to move it forward in an organized and persistent way, and not stop the first time the first guy at the UN says no. So you're talking in terms of a campaign. This is hard. Somebody has to put together a persistent campaign, learn the UN, learn to work the levers, come back. The Native Americans in Canada routinely use human rights complaints to the UN as a tool against their government. There hasn't been a UN complaint about the condition of people of color in this country for more than 50 years. So this is taking the agenda of Malcolm X and moving it forward. We don't know how to do that.
Okay, that's good. John Fisher and then Kamosi.
Follow up at this point. This report that's coming out on Tuesday regarding the court conviction of the Olympics, the organization that is preparing and issuing the report is called CORE, Center on Housing Rights and Evictions. They're based in Geneva, and they have the resources and the knowledge as to how to prepare complaints like that. And that's something that those of us who represent different groups and organizations, we can talk about going to them to seeing how would such a complaint be made. I know they've done it in other places, and they have connections with the United Nations. and that's something we can certainly pursue.
Okay, that is a, promoting, sorry.
And I'm talking more about this on the panel thing, but what we suggested around the Katrina thing was to have public hearings in each community that's been displaced with the refugees and have people testify by the thousands what happened. Then somebody has a camera, you record it, you build a national movement from the bottom up around that and make that your political agenda. Now, we did that when we had the Black United Front. I pushed that idea about police brutality. It took about a year before we did it. I don't know really remember it, but when they finally put posters up saying, does anybody know any person who was a victim of police brutality, whose family member was a victim, thousands of people lined up at the Harlem State Office building, they couldn't put them in there. And they took congressional records of it, right? It's a proven method in our community, and it works. Because people know, they've been waiting for some politician or some political leader to address the suffering they've been going through. So that it could be televised, put on the radio, make a documentary out of it, and use it as an organizing tool, and then finally take it to the United Nations. But that's the way to build it from below, and then also register people to vote so they take down these politicians who don't care about them around these issues. But that's it.
Right now, we are really getting down to business because it's not just about having the conference, but what are we going to, as Gil said to me last night, what is this all about, and what are we going to propose out of this conference to make a difference, to effect change of some sort. So what I'm suggesting, and we should take a vote now before the full body, and we would request that Professor Kamosi Woodard, who is going to be on the next panel, that he serves as our drafter, our author, along with us, to propose to have an open letter to the progressive movement, to whomever we want, of taking this proposal, this fact, this reality of forced genocidal displacement within a historical context of people of color, African Americans, with Katrina as an example of that, and for this proposal or this resolution to be presented to an international body, i.e. the United Nations, and work in concert with international groups who already have formed and aligned themselves around the issue of displacement throughout the globe, these mega project displacement, such as what John Fisher talked about this morning, 2 million people being displaced in China. 1.2, not 2, but 1.2. So, in terms of a working document that will bring us together, I am proposing to you, the body at the conference, that we do this. So, there's some discussion first? Yes. Yes.
If I may, my name is Sister Elizabeth.
Why don't you stand up, Sister?
My name is Sister Elizabeth, and the wisdom that's been shared today is phenomenal. Unfortunately, I think we're missing some of the pieces. Unfortunately, the UN does not have a military short of this military to enforce anything. So it's good that we move in that fashion, but we need to go back to foundation. We're right now starting hurricane season again. We're talking about Katrina and Rita, which were not natural disasters. Those were man-made disasters all day long. And until we organize community by community, block by block, whereby you have persons skilled and trained, first aid, CPR, basic medical response, all you're doing is just basically placing a Band-Aid on something that's not going to get solved, because then you're going to have your next group of people, you're then going to be talking about why they've had another massive death. So in my humble submission, I would say there needs to be additional meetings like these that are work groups. Everybody in here has a talent, a skill, knowledge base, and people they know. The Millions More movement has a 10-point area that actually addresses every area that I've heard everyone address. If we would get past the reinvention of the wheel, there are a lot of documents that have been written that say piece by piece what the solution is, but it seems to me like we need to put aside differences of politics and names and organizations and come under a banner of unity. The Honorable Elijah Muhammad said something that I think is one of the most profound statements. Unity is more powerful than a hydrogen or atomic bomb. So if we would only unite under a banner that's universal and make sure that we address every area that's affecting our community. The health of the nation is the wealth of the nation. So if we don't address health, economic empowerment, which is therefore then the wealth, the economic piece then turning into the real estate. In my humble submission, once again, I hear us talking about rents, but where's the collective business development? Where's the collective real estate ownership? There's enough people right in this room today to start another nonprofit organization that the persons in here run and control. There's more than enough funding available to address the issue. And then in addition, then you join forces with the international community. But we can't keep putting ourselves in the position where we're reactionary and waiting for someone else, because there is no one else.
Okay? That's okay. Well, let me address that. We can't solve all of the problems in one thing, and people are organizing. I run a non-for-profit organization, and I rarely get anything from foundations because it really is about the politics of funding. You talk politics, you don't get any funding. But what we're talking about here today is not about other programs, which are equally valuable, good, have relevancy, but what we're talking about here today is a specific proposal. Part of it is already happening internationally. Part of it is happening here in this country with respect to Katrina. The idea of the United Nations is not new. It was something that Malcolm X, El-Haj Malik talked about. So what we're talking about is what do we come up with the energy that we have put into this room about a proposal that we want to present and work with others on. We don't have to be under one umbrella in order to present a proposal. Kamosi Woodard.
The two proposals are not in the concept.
Not at all.
We need all those skills once we have
Exactly.
those hearings. But the problem is that much of these are revelations we hear in here today
Exactly.
that need to be broadcast to millions of people.
Right.
And part of the process of having public hearings is to do public education,
Right.
Real public and political education. So then, and the question of how we organize, obviously we have to do economic development and all that.
Exactly.
But until we wake more people up and have more resources, right? Otherwise, we wouldn't have to have these meetings, because if it was already done, we wouldn't have to have this meeting.
That's right.
So there's obviously more to be done.
Yeah, right. If it was happening, then there would be no need for us to be here. It's as if someone last night who said to us, she said, I've got the answer. I got the answer. Come to court. And then the response was, well, if you have the answer, then it wouldn't be happening. I mean, if you got the answer. So let's, Carmen.
Good afternoon. My name is Carmen Costa. I'm here from 1199 SCU organizer. And I followed the presentation. Are you married? Yes. Oh, beautiful. I wasn't sure, but at any rate, I think that the part that needs to come together is the tying in of the loose ends. I'm right now a student at Police College, and I have just gone through, in my poverty and affluence class, the American Apartheid. We read the book, and it's so amazing how things are coming into view at this point. Where you have in the early 20th century, the idea of the slums, the segregation, the redlining, all these issues, the gentrification, Hope 6, it's just a social mechanic
workshops. And remember, this information is really incredible. We have Professor Tony Montera. He's from Temple University, who's here. Norm Siegel is here. We're going to talk about Columbia University. Now, everybody has their program. Everybody has their program. For the people who want to participate in, we're at 3:30 to 4. Is it 2 workshops? Oh, building coalitions and alliances. Building coalition and alliances. No, she's coming into this work. That was a workshop that was canceled early. And the economic gentrification and economics. Who want to participate in that? Okay. Now, so we have 3 workshops, and this is what we're going to do. I'm looking for the guy who runs the church, because the largest group of people are going to go into the sanctuary. Brian, only 3 people who are interested in building alliances, right? Because you know what we can do? We can combine Columbia University's expansion and building alliances as we look at communities. So the people who are on building alliances, you come up here because each panel will have an hour and a half. And the other economic development, we will go upstairs. Okay?
You're for the Columbia thing?
Yeah.
What's that again? Columbia what?
Yeah, but we're going to talk about the Incarnation Children's Center. So you can ask questions. Hello?
With the local development corporation, with defending business rights and tenants' rights throughout the neighborhoods. I'm going to introduce them briefly, and then what we're going to go into is having each of our panelists today speak a little bit about their involvement around Columbia's expansion and their work on the issue and how they see Columbia's expansion as affecting the neighborhood of West Harlem. And so first, on my right, we have Norman Siegel. Norman is a former president with the New York Civil Liberties Union. His work has been around tenants' rights, civil rights throughout New York City. As far as First Amendment lawyers go, he has a great perspective on the rights of tenants. And currently, he's defending the business owners in the West Harlem community that wish to remain in the wake of Columbia's plan. Then we have Roland Benini. Roland has been involved for a long time in research, and I'm going to read a quick statement that he has. He's a Latino immigrant and executive director of Parents in Action for Leadership and Human Rights. And Parents in Action is a grassroots organization that aims to protect, preserve, strengthen, and if necessary, reunify families, the cell of human society which are under constant attack by the state and its agents. He is a strong advocate of the natural alliance of blacks and Latinos in order to raise ourselves in history. So that's Mr. Roland. Next we have Jordi Montrez-Blanc. Jordi is the chair of CB9, the community board. He's been a long-term resident of the West Harlem community and one of the most knowledgeable people about Columbia's plan and also the community's 197A plan to defend and to preserve the character of that neighborhood and create sustainable growth. And then we have Mario Mazzoni. Mario is
I'm currently a teacher in the New York public school system. Mario also has been a member for the past 2 years now of the Coalition to Preserve Community, which is a grassroots tenant-based community group that has been fighting for the rights of tenants in the area, mainly through protesting the Columbia administration and the city administration on how they've approached this plan thus far, fighting for the preservation of affordable housing, jobs, and no to the use of eminent domain and biotech research labs. And so I actually would like to begin just by giving a brief overlay of what Columbia's plan is. So when we hear Columbia's expanding into West Harlem, what does that really look like? And one of the pieces of that I think is really important is something that's happening with universities across the country. This idea that every 2 years, universities need to expand by 2.5 million square feet in order to remain competitive with each other, in order to have more research space, more classrooms, more office space for professors, so that they can continue to garner grants and profit from their research. I think this is really important because Columbia, over the past 250 years of its history, has been in a constant process of expanding from the time that it was located down Lower Manhattan until the 1960s and 50s, when it expanded throughout Morningside Heights, displacing tens of thousands of residents, to the 80s and the development of the Uptown medical campus, to today and this proposal for West Harlem. The particulars of Columbia's plan is for a campus that has a large footprint from 125th Street to 133rd Street between Broadway and 12th Avenue. That's a 17-acre site. 17 acres is bigger than the footprint of the World Trade Center. So if you can imagine in the site of Manhattan, that's one of the largest developments that has ever happened here. The plan itself is proposed to take the next 30 years to develop. About 5 years of that we're into because of the planning process, but then construction would go on until 2030 at best, and it would cost the university upwards $6 billion to build out its plan. Mainly what's included in the plan are research spaces for biotech research labs, neuroscience research labs, advanced technologies, advanced sciences, along with office spaces for administrators, staff employees of the university, and residential spaces and classroom spaces. And the campus itself would also build as high up as, at some points, the grand houses, if you've ever seen the grand houses on 125th and Broadway, and as far below ground as 7 stories, to make space for garages and the power station to actually run this campus. So it's a huge development over the future. I guess the last thing that I would like to say before getting into this is that unfortunately one of our panelists is running a little late, and one of our panelists can't be here. They both have really important voices. So of the panelist who is running late, Luisa Hernandez, she's a long-term tenant, will be with us shortly. She is a resident directly in this expansion footprint, along with the other 140 families that would be displaced by Columbia's expansion. Her building is in the Tenant Interim Lease Program, which was mentioned here today, a program to help low-income residents learn how to take care for their housing and then come to own that housing. And so she's been fighting directly to keep her right to remain in her home and come to own her home as that Tenant Interim Lease Program is staked out. The other person who unfortunately can't join us because of a family emergency is Marlene Petty. Marlene is a resident of 3333 Broadway. 3333 Broadway is the large former Mitchell-Lama complex of 1,200 units on the other side of 133rd Street, across the street from Columbia's plan. Already, this is the building that Nellie mentioned before. Already, this building has seen 200 to 300 of its residents have to leave their homes because of increases in the rents. And so I'll try to bring those perspectives in as much as I can, and I'm sure our panelists can also add to those things in talking about their own work. And myself, just so you do know who I am, I'm a student at Columbia University, and I'm a part of a student group called the Student Coalition on Expansion and Gentrification that see ourselves as a force in between what the Columbia administration wants to do to the West Harlem community and trying to organize the student body and raise consciousness around that. And so to get started, I'm wondering if actually, we should start. I'm wondering if you could start, Norm, and just give us an overview of the issues of eminent domain around this plan, and if there's anything that connects for you, Columbia's history as a developer in this plan.
Okay. Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here. The title of the conference is the first annual Harlem Anti-Gentrification Conference. The historic community of Harlem under attack. So true. Fight back and resistance, forging alliances and building principal unity. The issue of the Columbia expansion plan is smack in the middle of the title of this conference. And most of you, I would imagine, are here because you're concerned about what's going on not only in New York City, but in cities all across America, where upscale development, luxury housing is driving not just low-income people, but people who've lived in communities for a long time. And a lot of it's being driven by developers, and that's being driven by financial considerations. And then regular folk get squeezed out and pushed out. I'm here to tell you that we can fight back, that we don't have to allow that to happen the way it is happening. And for people who say you can't fight back and you can't win, I say they're wrong. And we can prove that on this project. One of the great things about this effort so far, which is 3 years in the making, is that it's brought people across racial lines together and brought people along economic lines together. If you just look around this room and you see African American, Latino, and Caucasian folk, you see people who are young, and then there's some of us like me who are not so young anymore. I just look young. But I've been doing this for many, many years. We have an opportunity in New York City, in West Harlem, to send out not only a clear message, but to